Okay. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us. Today we have the pleasure of reading and discussing a paper by Aditya Johnson-Kanu, who is a Ph.D. candidate in political science at UC Merced, where she works on the political economy of development. And her dissertation is on bureaucratic embeddedness and public goods provision in Nigeria. As you're aware, of course, today we're going to be discussing a different set of work on pre-colonial states and agricultural productivity today. Ada is going to start with a brief overview of the paper just to reorient us. And then we're really grateful to have Noah Nathan and Phil Roessler each provide about 10 or 15 minutes of comments. And then we'll open it up to the floor. So please think of questions as we go, and hopefully you'll have a chance to ask those at the end. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Ada to start with the presentation.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming here for this colloquium today. And thanks, Amanda, Phil, and Noah for serving as hosts and discussants here. And Aditya and I are very happy to get feedback on anything you think this paper could improve with. So I'm just going to give a brief overview, and then we'll just get into it. So this paper is about, This paper is about pre-colonial states in Africa and how the persistence or the transmission of these pre-colonial state capacities improves agricultural production in parts of the continent. So we observe that more than half of the population of Africa live in rural areas, and they live and work there, and they engage in agriculture. But then agricultural productivity on average across the continent is very low. However, this makes that people suffer food insecurity, and many countries have to rely on imports of food to meet domestic demand. And despite like the average, some people produce more than others, we still find that there are pockets of productivity in the continent. And we're trying to explain and understand why some places are more productive on agriculture than other places. So we argue that pre-colonial states provide a structure, right? So this tax collection capacity and population centers that colonial regimes and pre-colonial regimes built upon, right? And then this accumulation of this pre-colonial institutions, this pre-colonial territorial reach impacts agricultural production today. So this contemporary territorial reach has been built on from these pre-colonials, where pre-colonial states existed, right? So we notice that in colonial times, colonial elites built their administration in places which were already pre-colonial capitals. And these places were chosen because there was already a base there. There were already institutions and infrastructure to facilitate administration of these places. So places which were pre-colonial states tend to have a higher territorial reach, or the state has higher territorial reach in those places, and this facilitates agricultural productivity. So moving on from there, thinking about how do we measure this pre-colonial territorial reach, and how do we measure how the pre-colonial states have influenced contemporary agricultural productivity today, we create a data set of pre-colonial states. And we also record the capitals of the states. And then we take the georeference, the coordinates of these capitals, and we plug it into this graph here. So in this map, we show the location of pre-colonial capitals across the continent from our data set. And in our analysis, we find out that the proximity from these pre-colonial capitals influences the territorial reach, right? The proximity, so a place which is proximate to a pre-colonial capital has more territorial reach than those places that are far away from pre-colonial capitals. And in our analysis, we use spatial data. So the spatial data contains information on the agricultural productivity of each place there. So in each pixel, we have an estimate of agricultural productivity. And then we also measure distance from colonial capitals in buffers of 25 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, and 200 kilometers. And we just analyze how the distance from this pre-colonial capitals influences the agricultural productivity in each pixel. So we expect that those pixels that are closer to pre-colonial capitals should see a higher agricultural productivity compared to places which are farther away from pre-colonial capitals. And this is exactly what we find. So places which are closer, so like from 0 to 25 kilometers closer to pre-colonial capitals, see a higher yield in crops, right? And this is not just for food crops, it's also for non-food crops as well. And the charts here show that as one moves away from the pre-colonial capital, the productivity decreases, right? So we're saying that as farther away you are from the pre-colonial capital, the territorial reach of the state dwindles, and so agricultural productivity dwindles there. So moving on from that, trying to find out whether this is true, whether the territorial reach of the state is greatest the closer one is to a pre-colonial capital. We get spatial data on road densities, built up areas, the distance to the market, and just population density. And we find that the closer a pixel is to the pre-colonial capital, the stronger the territorial reach of the state is. So the closer it is to a pre-colonial capital, the more likely there are roads, more road networks there. The more likely there's going to be built up areas, and the more likely there's going to be population centers that develop where those pre-colonial capitals existed. And finally, just to give you an overview of like what we're thinking of for the next steps of this paper is, so in this draft here, we only did analysis on the proximity to pre-colonial capitals, but we know that pre-colonial states, their territory is broad, and we don't really have knowledge about that yet. So we're planning to digitize, or we've already started digitizing pre-colonial state boundaries to complement this analysis that we've done here. And then we also intend to investigate the impact of these pre-colonial states on the inputs, agricultural inputs. So right now we've looked at the productivity. So we've looked at the output, like how much food crops and non-food crops have been produced. But we also are interested in learning whether there's that intensive margin here. So what's the intensity of the inputs of agricultural inputs here, and how does that influence, how does pre-colonial states influence the intensity of agricultural inputs here? Okay, that's pretty much it. Yeah, so that's pretty much the overview here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can hear from the discussants.
Great, thanks so much, Ada. That was a perfect start. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Noah Nathan to give us some comments, and he'll speak for about 10 or 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Great, thanks Amanda, and thanks Ada for circulating such a great paper, both Ada and Aditya. It really was a joy to read and to give comments. So I just want to say up front that I think this paper represents a really impressive data collection effort, right? It provides a model, I think, of how to do thoughtful, rigorous, thought-provoking work with geospatial and historical data. And I'm also really excited by the work you mentioned at the end that you're going to be doing to digitize historical state boundaries. I think there's going to be big returns from doing that. So to summarize what Ada just said, the authors show that there's more agricultural output today in places that are more proximate to the historical capitals of pre-colonial states. And they argue that this is a path-dependent outcome of long-run differences in the territorial reach of the state, the extent to which the state projects authority with the local capacity to protect property rights and provide services that boost agricultural productivity. And so put simply, the argument is that the locations of pre-colonial states predict state presence in both the colonial period to the present day, which in turn, state presence predicts greater state investment in agricultural modernization that produces greater output in the modern period. And so I think while this paper is really actually in quite great shape empirically, the analyses are excellent, I want to push the authors to think more about the substantive interpretation of the findings, and especially about alternative mechanisms for these results. And my comments are coming from a growing concern I have with this whole emerging literature on the legacies of pre-colonial states in Africa, in which we now have a lot of evidence of correlations between pre-colonial characteristics and various present day outcomes. But most of these papers, and there are exceptions like Martha Wilfart's work and some others, but most of these papers are still pretty fuzzy on what the mechanisms actually are. And I think becoming as less fuzzy as possible for this paper is going to be a great margin on which you guys can improve as you keep working on it. So I have 5 main comments and then a few small notes I might mention at the end if I have time left. So the main comment is that there currently isn't actually much direct evidence in the paper that the mechanism is actually the territorial reach of the modern state or any sort of specific efforts the modern state might be undertaking to improve agricultural productivity. And so I'm completely convinced, especially by the placebo test, which I thought was a great thing to put in the paper, that the main correlation between the locations of historical capitals and modern output is a real thing. I think you've proven that. But the lack of evidence on modern state actions, I think, risks being a limitation because the results also appear consistent with me to a potentially even simpler alternative explanation, which is that what you're showing is the historical persistence of population density. So with all what we're really seeing is that places that had agricultural surplus that enabled them to sustain higher population densities in the distant past are still the places that have high agricultural surplus and maintain population density today, irrespective of whatever actual agricultural extension efforts the modern state may or may not be doing, or irrespective of the modern state's actual capacity to project authority into these areas. So you discussed population density briefly on page 9 as a potential mechanism, but it's only discussed in so much as it might affect the state's subsequent territorial reach. And I'm trying to argue that population density alone might explain these findings, even without any intermediate relationship with the state itself. So yes, high agricultural surplus and population density in the past might be an outcome of the historical presence of a pre-colonial state, and that's something the authors point out. But it could just as easily have been the original cause of the emergence of those pre-colonial states in the first place. So there's a recent body of work emerging on early state building. I'm thinking of Carlos Bosch's recent book called Political Order and Inequality, which is about the emergence of sort of pre-modern states. And his argument would imply a core reason that pre-colonial capitals were located where they were to begin with might have been because those were the places that had been able to produce agricultural surpluses, that had larger population densities, which incentivized the emergence of more sophisticated political institutions to begin with. That's why there were pre-colonial states. And several of the results seem more consistent with sort of a simple path dependence in population density than with like an active series of actions by the state itself. So figure 6 in the paper shows that agricultural output isn't actually higher near historic capitals because there's greater use of techniques like irrigation or greater agricultural productivity per acre farmed. In fact, the ratio of irrigated to non-irrigated lands appears to be flat across distance from historical capitals. And productivity in the 4th panel of that plot doesn't vary with distance to a historical capital at all. Instead, it appears that the output is higher near historical capitals simply because more land on the extensive margin is being put under cultivation in areas closer to historical cities, right? And so that seems a little inconsistent with the mechanism being something about agricultural modernization initiatives by a more present state. And relatedly, figure 4 shows that output is similarly high among both non-food and food crops. And if we think if this is really about sort of state-led commercial agriculture, this would be a story about non-food crops like cotton and rubber, not also food crops. And figure 8, I think, is particularly important to point out because it might not really be showing very much beyond that cities are right here, that cities are where the center of these historical states are. So road density is higher within 25 kilometers of pre-colonial capitals, and some scholars like Herbst use road density as a proxy for state presence. But road density is also going to be automatically higher wherever there's a city. And the remaining panels of figure 8 seem to simply show that areas closer to the locations of cities are still cities today. They have higher population density, more built up area, more markets. And so figure 8 might just be showing us the simple persistence of population density over time. And so something I'd want to see, for example, is road density actually higher in these areas even after controlling for population density or the other measures in panel 8? Or are we just showing that cities are here, not something about the state's particular territorial presence in those areas? And so population density might have direct effects on output today that match the results that don't necessarily work through the state's actions. So maybe what we're seeing is that farmers who live nearer to cities simply have greater private economic incentives to put the next marginal plot of land under cultivation because they have marginally better access to urban consumers and markets where they can sell their products than similar farmers who might live further afield. And in this mechanism, it's not that they're better at farming because they have some access to the state. It's just that they have more incentivized to do it because they happen to live closer to a large urban market. And urban areas tend to cluster in the places where population density was higher in the past on average. So I think you could ignore, not even get into the stuff on colonial indirect rule, all the stuff about tax collection, the citations to Mamdani, and already explain most of the key results in the paper if we thought that population density is sticky across time. And so I think the main challenge for the paper is thinking like, can we push beyond that mechanism for these results? So moving forward, I think there's also other literatures you guys could try to engage with as you seek to better clarify the mechanism. So one would be turning back to some of the existing Africanist scholarship on why there's been variation in the territorial reach of colonial and post-colonial states. And one source that stuck out to me in particular is Kathy Boone's 2003 book on the political topographies of the African state. And I think it's important for your argument because she argues that the territorial reach of post-colonial states is often deeply endogenous to pre-existing economic conditions, not just the cause of them. So it's not that there's more output in this place because the state is there, but the state is there because that was a place that had resources to extract. And she also shows that the relationship between the presence of pre-existing elites, such as traditional leaders that persisted from pre-colonial states via indirect rule, the relationship between the presence of those kinds of elites and the local projection of the state's power in the post-colonial period could actually cut both ways and didn't always follow the logic that's assumed in your theory. So in some cases, she shows that post-colonial state leaders systematically increased local state presence in areas of historical statehood in an attempt to displace and overcome the power of existing local elites. But she also shows that simultaneously within the same countries, the same state leaders in post-colonial period often kept the state intentionally weak and absent in areas that it had strong centralized institutions with strong pre-existing elites if they were striking political alliances with those elites that were helping those state leaders stay in power. So it wasn't just a uniform relationship that the state was more present in places that had sort of pre-existing traditional elites. Moreover, I would also recommend checking out the work of Johan Ricard Fuglet at Loyola. He was previously a Yale political science PhD, and he has an excellent working paper on this topic. So on the topic of where did the colonial state make investments subnationally, that I think is now forthcoming. And if memory serves, he finds a much less clear relationship between pre-colonial centralization and colonial state investment than the theory implicitly assumes in this paper. So I think he doesn't find that there's more state investment in more pre-colonial centralized areas, since I would recommend checking out that paper. I think another literature to engage with would also be literature on rural property rights. So smallholders' rights, at least in my understanding, are sometimes actually more secure precisely in the places with the strongest pre-colonial political institutions, places where there's been this persistence of powerful traditional chiefs rooted in pre-colonial states. And those smallholder rights and those traditional property rights systems might actually serve as a constraint on agricultural modernization and especially on large-scale commercial agriculture, not necessarily be the explanation for greater output or modernization. And so where traditional institutions were left in place as part of indirect rule, chiefs or other traditional leaders often still preserve rights over land, communal rights over land, or even regained them in the post-colonial period when they struck political bargains with state leaders. So this is great work by Kate Baldwin shows this, and Kathy Boone's more recent work on land talks about this. And research in economics, I'm thinking in particular of Goldstein and Udry's paper on pineapple farming in Ghana in the Journal of Public Economics, shows that traditional property rights institutions that might be persistent from these pre-colonial states and might be stronger in areas of greater pre-colonial statehood may actually be an active source of something depressing agricultural output, not improving it. And so it's not immediately clear to me from the literature on property rights that we would see the relationship that the paper proposes. A third literature that might be a little further afield that might be useful to look at, let me just check my time, okay. A third literature that might be useful to look at is I've recently for another project been reading a lot by the historian Polly Hill. It's this really amazing book on the emergence of cocoa farming in Ghana as an economic cash crop activity. And there's a whole bunch of other work by historians focused on sort of this period of the 19th century when cash crop economies emerged in a lot of West Africa, in between the end of the Atlantic slave trade, and so emerging around crops like palm oil, rubber, and other commodities. And what's really interesting about Polly Hill's work is that it shows that the emergence of profitable cash crop agriculture in West Africa was not always a state-led development or something that was a function of colonial state capacity and presence, but something could be an indigenous development produced via the private agency of African entrepreneurs acting on their own independently of the state, even before colonial rule came into effect. So she describes how the cocoa industry in Ghana, which today is centered in a region of historical state centralization in the Ashanti region, which seems to directly fit the author's theory, actually first emerged through the private efforts of non-Ashanti migrant farmers and merchants in the late 19th century who were acting at odds with the state, without state support, without colonial investments in their productivity. And this is something that emerged endogenously on its own. And this is just one example, but it stuck out to me because it suggests that the hypothesized relationship in the paper between agricultural productivity and sort of the state-led agricultural development might not be exactly as the authors are taking it. And so I think there's a lot of space here to give more evidence on what the mechanism actually is. So I have several ideas for new tests you could do to try to prove that. One is, would it be possible, and it sounds like from your last slide that you are starting to do this, but to collect direct data on actual post-colonial state-led modern agricultural initiatives? So I know, for example, in Tanzania, there's a famous history of collectivized farms. This also happened in a lot of West African countries in the 1960s and the 1970s. And if there was any way to code up a data set of where you got these big major state-led initiatives at agricultural modernization, and to show that those take place disproportionately in these areas around the historical capitals, that might really help us see, like, okay, in the intermediate step, the state is actually doing something that produces this outcome. It's not just a simple persistence of population density story. Alternatively, I don't think they do, but maybe the DHS surveys or other surveys have asked questions about contact with agricultural extension officers. And if there's any way to get survey data on that you could geolocate, that might be another way to make that kind of point. But that would be cool to be able to prove that. And I'd also think about trying to disaggregate your cash crop versus non-cash crop coding. Your food crop versus non-food crop coding instead into something that's more like cash crop versus non-cash crop. Because that's the real distinction that I think we care about. Is all we're really seeing that what's happening is that in closer to urban areas, crops that are primarily for domestic consumption, whether they're food or not, are put into more production? Or is it that entire cash crop economies that are mainly determined for export are actually more productive in these areas as well? And I think if you recoded the crops, you'd be able to make a more definitive claim about that. I have a couple of smaller comments about like how some variables are coded and stuff like that, but I think I'll stop here and just say this is a really promising start to a paper, and I'm really excited to see where you guys take it. And the data is amazing, and so I think you're going to do great things with this. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Phil. Thanks.
Thanks, Noah. Go ahead, Phil.
Great. Yeah. Well, let me reiterate what Noah said about the potential of this paper and how excited I am, about its contributions. I'm especially excited about the pre-colonial states data set that you all have assembled, and I want to say a little bit more about that because I see that as one potential major contribution. Just want to encourage maybe if there can't be some consolidation within this literature of existing data that's already been collected and engaging more with that. I think, the thing that definitely jumps out in reading this is the challenge of, disentangling the effects of agricultural potential and, current day agricultural output, right? And what's, is this going to be a function of the states that emerge, or as I think Noah put so well, is this a path-dependent story? In which ag potential, increases population density, the reproduction of agriculture, leading to continued agricultural output today. Because the way it was framed, I thought this was going to be a paper about, agricultural productivity. I was expecting to see results kind of at the intensive margin, and as Noah mentioned, we only see these results at the kind of extensive margin. So there was a bit of a disconnect there in the way that the paper is pitched. That agricultural productivity is so important, of course, to development. What are the paths in which we see this increased productivity? One way is through these pre-colonial states, and yet we see this persistence of areas that are productive, but not an increase in production in these existing areas. So I want to make kind of three big comments. One about the pre-colonial capitals and the clustering of pre-colonial capital cities. The maps in the paper are very illuminating. Thanks so much, for the clarity that these provide. But it does jump out at you when you look at the map of these pre-colonial capital cities that they cluster kind of on top of each other and proximate to each other. And this is not surprising given the path dependence that you're going to have, as we talked about, some population density in cities. As these kingdoms rise and fall, they're going to build on top of each other. But I wonder how you're addressing this in the data analysis. And I worry about double counting, that there are areas that are proximate to each other that are part of the same kind of historical population area, but counted as two kind of capital cities. That's not, you know, necessarily a problem, but it does perhaps point to the mechanism at work here, that it is, you know, ultimately a function of this underlying agricultural potential that, you know, produces these population centers that then kind of, you know, spread into, you know, maybe a single city or multiple cities. So I was wondering how you address that in the analysis. I was thinking, one, I worried that the grid cells, given how small they are, that you are able to pick up these multiple cities, and that you might consider rerunning the analysis at kind of a higher level of aggregation, and then you code, you know, whether there is a single, you know, pre-colonial capital city in this given area. Because I think what was really interesting was the interaction with the Murdoch analysis. You know, that was something that definitely came to mind when I'm reading this. I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. You know, one way to look at this are these pre-colonial capital cities. Are they parts of centralized states that are still intact at the time of colonialism, given kind of you know, the fluidity you have in, you know, pre-colonial states during this period, as you mentioned, because of the effects of the slave trade or changing economic conditions. And the Murdoch analysis was not as illuminating as I thought it could be, because any given capital city that's part of an ethnic group that was pre-colonial, that was centralized, you know, historically, would be picked up as centralized at the time of colonialism. So I wasn't convinced that you were able to kind of disentangle those states that were still centralized at the time of colonialism and those that were not. And I think that, you know, that would be really illuminating to better, you know, understand that, to kind of disentangle your mechanisms. You know, as Noah mentioned, you know, he put a lot of emphasis on the, you know, the path dependency, population centers. You know, that's important. But I think that the institutional channel is really, you know, it would be great to, you know, rule out one way or another. You kind of rule it in with the Murdoch analysis, but I don't think that, you know, that's, you know, sufficient. So one way you might be able to do this, and I think Carl Muller-Kreppeln is on the call. He can maybe chime in during the Q&A, but he has a fantastic new paper coming out in IO, in which he looks at institutional continuity of pre-colonial states. And he has this great measure of kind of disruption of institutional continuity, looking at ruler succession. And this might be one way you can directly test this institutional channel. If it's really kind of the continuity in the administrative apparatus or the pre-colonial institutions, then maybe using his, you know, coding, matching it onto your pre-colonial states data might give you some leverage here on better understanding this institutional channel. I think you have, you know, speaking of Carl's paper, I think you also have to engage a lot more with the direct and indirect rule scholarship. I mean, what's striking in his paper is the differences in institutional disruption between British and French colonies, whereas pre-colonial states kind of survive, at least in terms of the succession rules, at a rate of 70%. In French colonies, it's 30%. So you know, this is something, you know, obviously you know, there's been a lot written on this, but I think he address it in innovative ways, and, you know, bringing in this difference between British and or indirect and direct rule, and also addressing for colonizer effects would be interesting. So that also, you know, brings me back to my discussion on the pre-colonial states and the capitals. You know, there's been this resurgence in studying pre-colonial centralization and pre-colonial states, and I think it's been you know, so exciting for the study of African politics. You're building on this literature, and it's really exciting, the data set you've assembled. But and it's fantastic to go beyond Murdoch right? You know, everyone just uses Murdoch off the shelf, and there are clear limitations to that. But I think we're kind of struggling to come up with an alternative. And so I think we need some kind of, you know, consolidation and accumulation of knowledge in the data sets we're building on pre-colonial states. So Carl leverages a source I wasn't familiar with till I read his paper by Stewart that you might want to, you know, to cross-validate your data set with. Also, Jack Payne has a really great paper in IO looking at pre-colonial states in Africa and has a measure of pre-colonial states. It would be nice if we had some kind of triangulation between these data sets. And so I'm just curious about, you know, the data, you know, the sources you used, you know, whether there's overlap, you know, if not, where are those differences? Because I think that can be a major contribution, you know, of that paper of, you know, helping to come up with a standardized set of pre-colonial states that we can continue to leverage in our analyses. So a few kind of just minor framing, you know, points, you know, before opening it up to broader, you know, questions. One was, I think you pitch it as, you know, the colonial states, the colonial administrators, they viewed Africa in a certain way, but, you know, this rich pre-colonial history matters. I think the literature, you know, given the amount of work on pre-colonial states has moved on. So, you know, maybe more, you know, squarely engaging with the existing literature in pre-colonial states, you know, would be more effective on that point. And then, you know, just, you know, kind of the point I mentioned about agricultural productivity, and, you know, trying to better understand why we don't have these effects at the intensive margin, but we're getting these effects at the extensive margin, and then, you know, changing, you know, kind of the framing, you know, accordingly. But overall, you know, I think very exciting direction this paper is going, and look forward to continued discussion the rest of the call. Thanks,
Phil. Those were a great set of comments from both of you. I appreciate it. Otto, when we spoke before, you'd said you want to get as much feedback as possible. Do you, is that still the preference? Would you like to open it up? Do you want to respond to anything before we do?
Yeah, I'm very grateful to Phil and Noah for providing feedback, and this has given us a lot to think about and to work through as we keep revising this paper and adding more to it. So thanks very much for that. And I don't really have any comments to give back, but I'd like to hear more from everybody else.
Okay, so given the number of people on the call, I'd like to suggest that we try using the hand raising function within Zoom. So if you click on participants at the bottom of your screen, and then you can click next to your name, maybe even on your photo or video feed, to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question to Ada, and we'll work through the list. Looks like several people are interested. So we'll start with Ruth.
Great, so I thought this was a really great paper, and I'm excited to see how it develops. And I would agree with the first comments about sort of this question of whether it's really state capacity doing the work. So really sort of questioning the mechanisms a bit more. And I think there are lots of directions to go depending on what you really believe and what you find evidence for. But I think if you do dig into that as the mechanism, that's really at odds with all this Washington consensus recommendations to reduce state involvement in order to promote economic development and in particular agricultural productivity. And so that's provocative, that's interesting. I mean, I think if that's the way you want to go, that could be something for the framing. And then I was going to follow up over email, but I recently reviewed a dissertation from a student in University of Pretoria who has this really neat analysis of state-led agriculture programs, so food security policies. So if that's a channel you want to explore, following up on Noah's last comment, I can make that connection, but really neat stuff.
Thanks, Ruth. Molly?
Hey, Anna, this was super interesting, and I'm always excited when I see maps in an article. So I'm really grateful that you guys did such a great job with that. One small thing that I would suggest, and you say it in the notes, and I'm really glad you have notes because a lot of people will skip over those. I think it would be helpful if you had a color-coded key for each one of your maps, because you know, in the figure where you're talking about the different raster point values, it's not clear. I assume green means higher, but I don't know for sure. And in the other climate maps as well, it's not labeled, so it's color-coded, but I don't always know what that means. But that's just a small thing. The one thing that I would encourage you to think about, and some of this might come from the limitations on data, but I think it would be valuable for you to kind of potentially engage this idea, or at least acknowledge it. When I was thinking about pre-colonial states as you have them represented here, the thing that occurred to me is your analysis is kind of implicitly assuming that they're all equal, or at least that they all have kind of equal or constant state capacity. And some of that's just because data is limited. And, you know, maybe this speaks to some of Phil's points about trying to build together and cross-validate across data sets a little bit more. But it just kind of occurred to me that, you know, not all pre-colonial states will be equally well institutionalized. And so I just wondered if there's any way for you to maybe address or capture some of that variation. But this is awesome.
Thanks, Molly. All right, I have Jonik next, and just so that everybody's aware, then I have Carl, Vlad, and Alex. So Jonik?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. So my contributions are, I guess, with expanding like the wider data set of pre-colonial states. I noticed like with the map that you showed, particularly like along the East African coast, I felt like there were some states that were excluded that should be there, particularly the city states. I'm thinking here of Zanzibar, Mombasa, and these states also like persisted into colonial times. Like Zanzibar pretty much persisted into the independence period in its pre-colonial state until it transitioned into colonial state, and then it united with Tanganyika to form Tanzania. But yeah, there are a couple of states along the East African coast, like there were city states. So I'm wondering like why they would have been excluded. And Zanzibar, pointing out, especially because I know they specialized in cash crops too, like spices. The other city states, maybe that one you might have to look into them agricultural wise, but they're all part of a wider network of the Indian Ocean trade. So I think you want to look at the city states along the East African coast. They stretch from Somalia. I noticed you did have one state from Somalia, all the way you'll say to Mozambique. So just take a look. And for the purposes of your paper, I think like maybe because they are city states, since for your data set, you still look at like reach in terms of like 25, 50 kilometers, maybe looking at their interland will be like the coastal belt and see if the effects persist there, not just on the island itself. And this other question was more like a methodological question thing. I'm not sure about this, so it's just something that came up while I was reading this. I wondered about like, so in this paper, when you're focusing on agriculture, you're talking mainly about cultivation of crops. So I haven't had anything about like, if you're talking about mixed farming, so keeping of livestock. So I was wondering if, and it's just a thought, I have no idea if this is true. I assume this excludes states that must have been composed of I want to say pastoralist groups or nomads. I know they're kind of rare, but and this is more on me. I was trying to think of like nomadic states, because if you think about like in Central Asia, in Mongolia with Kublai Khan and the Mongolian Empire, and those were made of nomadic tribes, and maybe their capital city was always like moving, like it's with the emperor or the king. I was wondering if pastoralists might have been excluded from the study, just with the nature of what you're studying, like you're just looking at cultivation of crops instead of also considering the livestock keeping. That's all.
Thanks. Ada, I'm going to keep going through the list, but if at any time you want to jump in, please let me know. I have Carl next.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ada. This is a great, super interesting paper and topic, and I'm very excited to see this. So I'm not going to repeat what Phil already has said about indirect rule in British versus French colonies. Just wanted to add to that, that I think that contrast, if you find that it exists as well, would be a really cool way to distinguish the persistent effect of institutions versus the persistent effect of local demographic population density. Because the institutions on the French side were oftentimes discontinued, so there you shouldn't expect kind of an institutional effect that much. And then I had one more technical question about your randomization inference, where I wondered how realistic your counterfactual simulations are. I fear a little bit that there is so much variation within river basins that kind of the counterfactuals you throw like darts on the map are not really realistic, because they oftentimes lie in areas where no state would have been located. And one important example, I think, is, for example, the inner Niger Delta or the Great Lakes area, which are part of kind of a larger river basins, but are very, very specific areas within that basin where we would expect states to be located, areas which have typically a very high population density, very rich and nutritious soils, and so on and so forth. Whereas the rest of the Niger basin is not as well suited for putting up a state. So that's just kind of one comment. And I think Phil Roessler and Yannick Pengel and the others do a great job in their recent paper on the long-term effects of cash crop production, of really trying to simulate realistic counterfactuals for, in their case, colonial cash crop production. Just to have kind of a look at. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. Vlad?
Hi, thanks very much for sharing the paper. I also enjoyed it. I too am not going to repeat what people have said. I think in one sentence, I would say I worry that there's sort of, you're picking up the post-treatment bias of the initial climatic conditions. But again, that's something that other people have already raised. I have two things, one sort of big one smaller one. So the big one is that I think the conclusion that for me comes from the paper is fairly sad, in the sense that you sort of say, you know, that today's agricultural outcomes go all the way back to something that we cannot really change. And yet, if you think about the mechanism, which is institutions, one would think and believe that institutional organizations can, or institutions can actually be changed. And so I was sort of wondering if you wanted the paper to come across as perhaps deterministic as it comes for me, or if you wanted to maybe mention more about how the institutions in fact could still be changed. So the pre-colonial history sort of orders the structures in a certain way, but that doesn't mean that we cannot, that they're immutable. It doesn't mean that we cannot change them in some way. And the smaller point that you may want to look into is, so when I was reading your Murdoch analysis, I noticed that you were using this variable, which isn't what's typically used as a centralization variable, where it has like 4 different or 5 different levels, right? One of them is big states, one of them is these petty chiefdoms, things like that. And I think the variable that is typically used from Murdoch is variable number 33, which is centralization. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because the one that you used has, I would say, maybe 67% missing data, whereas the classical centralization variable 33 has maybe 20 or 30% missing data. So that's just a simple way of, I think, increasing the number of observations. Thank you.
Thanks. Alex is next.
Hi, I'm just gonna, this was a great paper. I really enjoyed reading it. And one thing I really liked about it was that you kind of take the claim about kind of pre-colonial states in Africa being kind of quite different from how we think about states. So I think that keeping that buffer kind of treatment as you go forward and kind of incorporate boundaries, like I'm sure you're planning on doing it, but I don't want that to get lost in kind of future iterations of the paper. And I was just kind of gonna double down a little bit on points that Noah made and kind of Vlad alluded to just now, which is that I think kind of taking kind of variation in how these strong pre-colonial states interact with the colonial state and with kind of independence governments a la topographies is kind of a very good suggestion. Because, when I was thinking about this, I was looking at the kind of examples in Southern and North Africa where you have kind of these big settler states who come in and kind of remake things and kind of wipe out these kind of indigenous agricultural organizations and then replace them with a very different type of agriculture. So kind of thinking about something like that versus a more cash crop economy. And I think pulling that apart and pulling the different kind of relationships and engagements that these states had with the kind of colonial and independence governments could kind of bring politics like much more clearly into the paper. I always get pushback when I write about agriculture that there's never enough politics in it. And I think that just kind of like making that clear, and it's clear from the introduction and the conclusion that you're really interested in these questions, but that would be, I think, really good. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Carolyn?
Yeah, thanks. I will reiterate a couple of things people have said, especially Noah's, first comment about the great job that, this is really fascinating. I think you guys have done a great job demonstrating this continuity of the location of the centers that's really important. I would agree with the assessment that where it needs the most work is on justifying the claims about the mechanisms for that. And Noah focused on sort of the mechanism of whether current agricultural productivity is based on what states are doing. I think another part of the mechanism is that you also argue that pre-colonial states transmitted their administrative structures, and I think that part of it also needs a closer look. And a related comment to that is a concern about sort of how you look at pre-colonial states over quite a long time period, I think 350 years. And some of the states you're looking at had completely disappeared by the time of colonialism. And so, that almost to me reinforces the argument that what you're getting is about either population density or even underlying that ecological zones. If a state hadn't been there for 150 years, how was it transmitting institutions? So I think looking at the timeframes for those pre-colonial states and maybe, grouping them into some categories and testing how that, the time frame in which they existed matters might be worthwhile. And just one final comment, and this is an area I would know a ton about, but just thinking about your maps of the ecological zones and thinking about how much that may have changed over time also, especially in the Sahel-Sahara region. So not my area, but anyway, great, but some really great stuff here. So thank you very much.
Okay, Yannick?
Hi, thanks so much for this very exciting paper. I want to build a little bit on Noah's first comment on the potential persistence of population density. I think one thing that would help in the write-up and potentially also in the analysis is to think more and write more about what role agriculture played in the origin stories of these individual states. Because there is a long literature in the long-term emergence of states theories about how the ability to feed dense populations due to agricultural productivity played a huge role. And there's James Scott's most recent book, who sort of restricts that to cereal grains as one particular type of crop that was especially important for the formation of early states. And maybe by using, for example, FAO suitability data and controlling for that, or running your placebo analysis and making sure that your placebo distributions kind of match different types of crop suitabilities or agricultural caloric suitability more general, would make this more credible. And I'm pretty sure that this simple agricultural state formation story doesn't really work in Africa, and that could actually work in your favor. If you could show that you find higher agricultural suitability in places of centralized states that were plausibly emerging not due to like a high agricultural surplus in pre-modern times, but due to, say, long distance trade networks or anything along these lines, that would potentially help you to separate this mechanism.
Thanks. Okay, so we don't have anybody in the queue right now, and just a few more minutes. Ada, is there anything that you would like to say to wrap up, or any questions you have for the group?
Thank you everyone for all the feedback. I don't really have any questions to ask the group. I'm just really grateful that we have stuff to think about now. And some of the questions some of the comments we got, we've already been thinking about these things. And it's just interesting that other people see different things that we've not seen. And I'm just happy that we have a lot to think about now. So we are really, this is a paper that we, halfway through we kind of rearranged how we're thinking about it. And it's interesting that some of the comments kind of mirror what we're thinking about previously before we reorganized the paper and made this framing that we're currently working on now. So we're gonna go back and look through the stuff we had before and see how that blends into what we have now. And thank you for pointing out some of the things that we had not seen ourselves. So the part about the other data sets that exist for pre-colonial kingdoms, besides the Murdoch data, that's really important. And I think I'm really glad that Phil pointed some of these out. And so we can go check it out and see how our data that we're collecting matches up with what other people are doing, and probably hope to speak to all those other scholarship on the same topic. I'm thinking about how to situate this paper on the politics side of it. I think that's important too, because we've been thinking about this. Some of our ideas came from just the literature on rural institutions and agricultural productivity and the ecological side of it. So most of the stuff we've read on agricultural productivity all has to do with, sorry, I forget what the point I was gonna make there, but I'm really happy that we got a lot to think about now. And if it sounds like my voice is a little bit weird, that's because I'm a little bit under the weather now, and fingers crossed, it's nothing really serious. So I'm really grateful for APCG for organizing this and accepting our paper and allowing us to get lots of feedback from people here. This is very good. There's a lot of material I have written down, and I hope to go back and we can start working on this again to get it to a point where we can, send it somewhere.
Thanks so much, Ada, and I think you should be really proud. There's a lot of interest here, clearly, and really great engagement. Thank you to everybody that joined us, and we'll be posting the paper and the recording after, so please look out for that. So thank you so much to Ada and to Adi, co-author, and to Noah and to Phil, especially for giving comments. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Ada.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.